Well, I'd like to thank two people. Penn Bogart, who used to work at the Filson Club, who did a lot of research into Kentucky newspapers. The Louisville Courier, in particular, was a Southern sympathizing newspaper, and that's where you find all the slave ads printed. And then the Louisville Journal was pro-Northern. So Penn did a lot of research on that and pulled out the stories of some of the fugitive slaves that were escaping across the river and what happened to them. And the second person I'd like to thank is Pam Peters, who is very encouraging about research, and she's helped me a lot. So thanks, Pam. I have been asked to speak to you about Guinea Bottoms. Of course, that's the area down in Clarksville around the Clark Homesite Park. And George Rogers Clark, of course, was a slave owner. And Kit was his body servant, probably since Clark's birth in 1752. That's the general way that things were handled among slaveholding families. As each child was born, they got their own personal little servant to play with, and then when he grew up, the servant was a slave. Those enslaved people came to Kentucky with Clark, and even though it was illegal, he brought them into Indiana in 1802. And in 1802, the first black settlement, as we think, was in the state of Indiana. It's hard to prove something like that, but 1802 is awfully early. So it was called Guinea Bottoms, and the reference, of course, Guinea is in Africa, and that means black. So that's why it was called that. Guinea Bottoms, we think, was a smattering of small cabins scattered in the lowlands on Clark's farm at the Point of Rock on the Ohio. And the reason we know that is in the Draper manuscripts, a collection of Lyman Draper, the famous Clark historian, who wanted to write a biography of General Clark and spent his entire life gathering information from Clark family members and descendants and other people who knew General Clark and some of the other people who came to Kentucky. Sadly, he died in the 1880s without ever writing the biography, but we have his notes, and those are gold about the Clarks. So General Clark's farm at Point of Rock on the Ohio had a coterie of slaves there. They were with him during the Revolutionary War, and the reason we know that is because the Illinois Sons of the American Revolution paid to have General Clark's receipts, his famous lost receipts, so that they wouldn't have to pay him or reimburse him for money that he had spent during the Revolutionary War on his soldiers. They were eventually found in the 1830s, I believe it was, in the courthouse in Richmond, Virginia. And so the Clark family were furious, and they filed a lawsuit against the government, and they were awarded about $50,000. George really never got much of anything from that. But from those receipts from the Illinois Regiment, we know that he had the following people with him. We assume that Kit was there because it was typical for soldiers who owned slaves to have a body servant that they would take with them wherever they went. William Clark, for example, George's younger brother, had, just went to say his name and it went right out of my head. York, thank you, who also lived at the Falls of the Ohio before the expedition took off. So York went with him, so why wouldn't Kit go with General Clark? But we also know that he had Caesar, who was an artillery man, meaning he took care of the guns and cannons. And he had Tom, I think that he bought during the time that he was in the Revolutionary War from an officer who had died. And he had Lou, and we know this because their names are mentioned in the receipts. There's something like 49 mentions of General Clark's Negroes or man in those receipts. Most of them are not named, sadly, so we don't know who they all were. We, from the Draper manuscripts, also know that Kit, his body servant, was married to Daphne, who was a cook. They lived there at Guinea Bottoms. Tom was married to Aunt Esther. Old Henry was there. Ben and Venus Mcgee. And there were also some free blacks living at Guinea Bottoms, big surprise. One of them's name was Robert Loy, or Lloyd. We don't know exactly what the name was, but he's in early Clark County records and was the subject of a lawsuit about something. That's just how we know about him. We know that James was living there. James doesn't have a last name, but we know that he was there in that area and was captured by a boat of men that pulled over right around that area, and they just grabbed him and took him down south and sold him. And he was a free man. So, you know, you had to be really careful because you were on the borderlands. There were also enslaved people who were set free by the Goodwin family, who eventually lived in up near Charlestown off Stacy Road. And they had set some enslaved people free, and they were said to have lived at Guinea Bottoms. Guinea Bottoms, of course, was conveniently close to the river, and that river was at least 10 feet lower back in that day than it is today, and even lower than that during droughts. So it would have been maybe a little easier to get across the river because black people were never taught how to swim. They weren't taught north, south, east, and west. It was illegal to teach them to read. So that was all to keep them down. So it probably would have been a little bit easier to get across. You could probably almost walk across on dry land. I've read that, so I know that's true. Neither Pam Peters nor I have found any evidence or any articles from newspapers about fugitive people crossing the river at Clarksville, but we don't doubt that it did likely happen because of the ease it would have been. It wasn't until the late 1820s that things regarding runaways became organized on the Indiana side of the river. Ben Mcgee was still at Guinea Bottoms in 1820. He had been on the Lewis and Clark expedition. He was a man who handled the horses. And he was, of course, married. And he went to St. Louis after Lewis and Clark got back from the expedition. He lived with William Clark. Even though he probably didn't want to, he had to. He probably was one who helped black people escape after he came back in the teens or 20s. They would need to almost evaporate quickly, as Pam said, because it was so dangerous on this side of the river. You actually had both kinds of people, of course, living here. Josiah Reeder was the wharf master in Jeffersonville during the early years, and he was a slave catcher. And if you caught them, you could take them across the river to Louisville, and they stayed in jail for 2 weeks, and if no one claimed them as a slave, they could be sold, and then you were paid. So there were people like that on this side of the river, too. Everything wasn't cake and ice cream over here, especially for black people. So they would even hire black men to work at night in some of the warehouses in downtown Jeffersonville, and then a group of those men would drop in on them, capture them, tie them up, and take them across the river to Louisville, where they would sit for 2 weeks if nobody claimed them, and then they'd be sold. So there was money in it for people. That's why they were involved in it. The escape routes over on this side of the river, and you can see some of them. I've highlighted them in red. Those are basically where Highway 31, Highway 60, what is present-day Highway 62, and you have some crossings. We were right across the river from 2nd and Main, or 2nd and Market, whichever one it is. Can never get that right. The slave market in Louisville was right across the river from us. So, you know, people were watching Jeffersonville fairly closely. In 1809, General Clark had an accident. He had a stroke, and he fell with his right leg in his fireplace at his house at Point of Rock in Clarksville. And it was a long time before they found him. The leg had to be amputated later over in Louisville, and we are told by an article in a local paper that Uncle Tom and Aunt Esther took the opportunity to disappear at that time. So they wandered off. Nobody knows what happened to them or where they went. So that happened. And then, of course, when Clark left, the Clark family wouldn't let him stay over here anymore because of the danger to him. So he went to live at Locust Grove the last 9 years of his life. And at that time, Guinea Bottoms kind of faded out, even though the one man stayed there, Ben Mcgee stayed there. Jeffersonville, we think, was the first and largest underground railroad in the state of Indiana, and Oberlin College in Ohio was funding the establishment of Negro churches in certain areas in the town. And Jeff had a lot of little areas of African American settlements. There was Egypt, Bucktown, which was down close to the river. Egypt is where Colgate is. There was, what is it called? I can't think of it right now, but there were a number of them that were over there. And their goal, of course, of these Negro churches was to help as many fugitives escape as possible. We did have, like I said, Josiah Reeder, the wharf master, who was kind of a bad character. We had Harriet and Joshua Dunlap, who were free blacks who came down to Jeffersonville in 1847 from Patriot, Indiana, which is another peninsula, out into the river. And on a peninsula like Jeffersonville was, you had 3 ways that you could get across the river to try to avoid being captured, 3 sides out in the water. So they came down here. Harriet bought a house on Walnut Street behind where St. Luke's Church is now, and that's where they lived. We would not know anything about them if it weren't for a tiny little article in the Indianapolis News. They moved to Indianapolis after the Civil War was over, and there's a little obituary in there for Joshua Dunlap, who died in 1872 in Indianapolis, and it said in the colloquial, he run off many a slave from Kentucky. And he worked as a substitute broker during the Civil War, getting men to join up for a bounty. That's what he did. So we know that about him. And Harriet, she was also in on it. We also had Dr. Nathaniel Field and Mrs. Field of Jeffersonville. Dr. Nathaniel Field was probably one of the best men who ever lived. He came from a slave-holding family over in Middletown, Kentucky. His father owned lots of slaves, and he, the son, hated it. He moved to Jeffersonville in 1829, and he became the city father here, and that's when the Underground Railroad really took off in Jeffersonville. He established the Advent Christian Church in Jeffersonville, just a few blocks from his home. And it's funny, that's near where the Dunlaps lived. You research this and you begin to find all these aha moments. Lanciscus family was involved in the Underground Railroad here. Basically, anybody who went to the Advent Christian Church. Let's see, who else was that? Mayor Oswald Woolley and Mayor Uriah Dameron were mayors in the 1850s of Jeffersonville. Both of them were arrested for man-stealing. They were supposedly tried in the courts of Louisville. Sadly, Louisville has lost a lot of its early records. So you can find where they were arrested and you can find where there was going to be a trial, but sometimes you can't find the trial. So that's what happened. And of course, I talked about the Advent Christian Church. There was a member, Mrs. Affleck. This is part of women's roles in helping the Underground Railroad. She was arrested for buying a ticket for a black man on the railroad up north to Indianapolis. The Reverend Calvin Fairbank, I don't know if you know about him, he was out of Ohio. And he was arrested in Jeffersonville for helping a slave woman escape. She got on the train to Salem, and she was met by the black barber of Salem, who was the station master there. He spent, I think, 14 or 17 years in prison. They nearly beat him to death because they hated him. He was in the Kentucky State Prison. Not a place you wanted to go if you'd been involved in the Underground Railroad. You have Hannah and George Washington Tolliver. She was one of only 7 women arrested on the wharf at Louisville. Her husband was a black boatsman, and he paddled his little boat over to the river, and I'm sure they helped many slaves escape. She was imprisoned at the Kentucky State Pen until 1865 when she was finally freed. And she came home. She lived here for a while, and then I lose track of her. And George apparently was dead by that time. Interestingly, George Tolliver's father was Abraham Tolliver, who was allied with the Indians up around Vincennes. He lived just outside the Indian camp up there. And it turns out that he went to Albion, Illinois, where he ran the Underground Railroad station out of his home. So you begin to see all kinds of little connections in this. It is heartwarming. I've been through the Clark County deed records, and I found what I probably should have known already, that the deeds are have records of enslaved people who were either purchased, like by Mayor John Daniel Schreier, who purchased a man in the 1840s and freed him. As soon as he got him on this side of the river, he set him free. There were several of those documents in there. There are enslaved people who were brought here from the South by their owners and manumitted, and one of them in particular was a little girl who was freed, and apparently her mother was black and her father was the white man who freed her. And they came from the deep South to do that. So, you know, it's not a romantic kind of a thing. We had both kinds of people here, the good and the bad, and some of the bad were awful, and some of the good were very good. Dr. Field's son let it out that his father wasn't heavily involved in the Underground Railroad, and he said, my father used to keep the enslaved people in the basement during the day, and he would take them out at night and send them on to the next station. So that's a heartwarming thing to learn that there were some good people here who cared about other people regardless of what their skin color was. Thank you very much.